Hello, everyone. Longtime viewer of Blogging Heads here. My name's David Masciotra, and since this is my first public discussion here on Blogging Heads, let me just introduce myself. I'm coming to you from beautiful town of Highland, Indiana, and it was raining earlier, but it stopped, which is unfortunate because our topic is existentialism today. I'm a regular writer for Salon. I've also written for The Atlantic and the Daily Beast, and I've written a couple of books, most recent of which are Mellencamp American Troubadour, put out by University Press of Kentucky, and a 33 and a third book on Metallica's self-titled record, better known as the Black Album, and that's published by Bloomsbury. I'm very excited today to have this dialogue with Bill Irwin, who's a fascinating philosopher, superb writer. You might have seen just over the weekend he had an excellent essay in the New York Times about wrestling with faith and doubt and different conceptions of God. But I'll let Bill take over before we get into it. Bill, is there something you'd like the audience to know about yourself?
Well, thanks, David. I guess we have a bit of a mutual admiration society here in that I'm a big fan of your Metallica book. And part of the story behind that is that I'm the editor of the Blackwell Philosophy and Pop Culture series and had published a book on Metallica and philosophy in that series myself. And what else to say? I'm a professor of philosophy at King's College in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, where it's always gray and dreary, and so that will fit the existentialist mood here, although I think we'll talk a little bit about the way that existentialism offers a kind of tough-minded optimism as well.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's a great place for us to start. Your newest book here, The Free Market Existentialist, Capitalism Without Consumerism, is something I really enjoyed reading, and I found myself equally comforted and challenged by it, which is always a great sign of an argumentative book. I don't just want to be coddled, but at the same time, I don't want someone throwing me up against the wall the entire time either.
Right.
You provide a fantastic definition of existentialism several times in your book. And it's one I've taken to using with my students because it's an accessible definition, but its accessibility doesn't sacrifice accuracy or authenticity. So if we could just start with a little existentialism for dummies, in case there's anyone watching who's unaware of the term, how do you define existentialism and what does it mean to you?
Sure. Well, according to some people, existentialism is only for dummies, but hopefully we'll disprove that in our discussion. It's tough to define. Whatever I say is controversial, but this is what I came up with, and you were so kind to comment on. By my loose definition, existentialism is a philosophy that reacts to a perceived absurd or meaningless world by urging the individual, right? Individual rather than the collective or the group, to overcome alienation and oppression and despair by acts of freedom and self-creation in order to become a genuine person, or what in the existentialist parlance would be an authentic person. And of course, that word authenticity gets bandied about a lot these days in non-existentialist circles.
All right, let's take that term by term here, break it down for just a few minutes. First of all, explain that the world is absurd. This is a point that Camus makes, of course, brilliantly in The Myth of Sisyphus. What does that mean to you, that the world is absurd? And the existentialist begins with this, or from this vantage point.
Right. Again, part of the problem in speaking about existentialism is that even a word like absurd gets used differently by different existentialists, but you mentioned Camus, who has probably the most famous account of it. And basically for Camus, the idea of absurdity is that the world doesn't fit with our expectations. And well, we've all had this experience. Go wait online at the Department of Motor Vehicles, and a line that should move quickly does not move quickly. Somewhat more tragically, think of the girl you loved in high school who didn't love you back. Unfortunately, the world is far from any kind of Garden of Eden paradise where our desires match up with the way the world actually is. Camus actually comes to a neat conclusion about that, which is that the world itself isn't so much absurd as is our interaction with it, that we experience absurdity because we demand things of the world, which it just isn't there to provide, and ultimately counsels us to accept what he calls the gentle indifference of the world. The world isn't out to get us. It just doesn't particularly care about us.
Yeah, and we should acknowledge that you and I share a secular existentialist worldview. There are some Christian existentialists, there's some Jewish existentialists, there's even a book on Buddhist existentialism. But correct me if I'm wrong, but according to my understanding, we both agree that the universe does not know that we're here.
Right. And I mean, that's an excellent point. And it's part of the difficulty in saying anything universal about existentialism. Kierkegaard, who by most accounts began existentialism, or was at least the forefather of it, was devoutly religious, as were some of the other French existentialists, Gabriel Marcel. And you mentioned actually Buddhist existentialism. There's a great book called Alone with Others, and maybe that's even what you were thinking about.
Yeah, that's the one I was referring to there. Very good.
That title just resonates as really what existentialism is about, right? We are always with others. We can't avoid the confrontation with other people and the way in which those interactions make us self-aware and uncomfortable. And yet there's a kind of a bridge of subjectivity that can't be fully crossed. There's always some separation between us and the other person, even the person who is closest to us or the person we love most.
Now, every life, to some degree, some, of course, and we look at it with sympathy and mourning, more so than others, but every life is filled with its share of trauma and tragedy and heartbreak and hardship. And oftentimes, if there are any reasons for these tragedies and traumas, which you and I would overall deny, the reasons are inaccessible. They're not one that someone can investigate and find an answer to as if they're solving a case in some procedural detective story. So you suggest in your definition of existentialism, as does Camus, that you combat this condition with what you just referred to as authenticity and acts of self-creation. Now, we'll pick up on the theme that some of these terms leave great room for freedom and flexibility in definition and interpretation. But what do those terms mean to you?
Just hit that again. Which terms specifically?
Authenticity and self-creation.
Yeah, good. So authenticity, as you know, gets used differently by different existentialists. To me, it's all about taking account of individual freedom and individual responsibility, so that no matter how awful the circumstances I find myself in may be, and no matter how much to blame others or society may be for that, I need to take account of my own responsibility and my own freedom. And so Camus, who we're sort of taking our jumping off point from, doesn't really use the term authenticity, but his iconic figure is the myth of Sisyphus, where from Greek mythology, the character of Sisyphus is punished by having to roll a rock up a hill every day, only to have it fall back down again. And he concludes the myth of Sisyphus by saying that we must imagine Sisyphus happy. And that's the sort of inspiration that I take from existentialism, that no matter how awful the objective situation may be, that we can always, within the context of our own mind, change our orientation on it. Now, how Sisyphus can be happy is perhaps another question. Authenticity, should we move on to that, or?
I'd like to stop you right there, if you may,
Yeah.
just to ask you a question. I want to pick up on that thread. At the beginning of our discussion, you used the phrase tough-minded optimism. And I'd like to discuss something about existentialism here. Many people find the perspective that the world is without objective meaning so bleak and grim that it prohibits them from entertaining it. And, of course, Sigmund Freud said that as long as people fear death, we'll have religion. So there's all these systems of belief that offer consolation when people suffer and when people lose. Why is existentialism something that provides you with tough-minded optimism? And how do you think that such a worldview benefits people who hold it?
Yeah, no, that's a very important question. What I had said was roughly a paraphrase from the chief existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre, who, being accused of pessimism, characterized his own philosophy as one of optimistic toughness. And I think you're right that the reaction of people to the idea that their world, their life may be without objective meaning given from outside by a god is a thought too awful to contemplate, and so they simply reject it. It's a kind of, I call that the aesthetic fallacy, the idea that what is true needs to be beautiful and good as well, and that simply isn't the case. Anyone who's lived long enough in this life knows that's not so. We have to deal with reality on its own terms. And the stereotype of the existentialist is of the person despairing in some black and white film in some French cafe, smoking stinky cigarettes and crying in their red wine or whatever. And that's certainly one way to go, but it really isn't what Sartre or Camus or any of the existentialists prescribed. It may be a period that some people have to kind of go through if they embrace this worldview, but it certainly isn't the goal.
Yeah, and it seems to me that the recognition that the universe doesn't know that we're here provides a tough-minded optimism, but also makes the blows and bruises that we suffer in life more manageable. Of course, many people would disagree with this. Religious people often turn that around and say, well, if there's not some divine plan that includes your suffering and disappointment, then how could you continue? But if you're merely a subject to a divine plan, I find that really disempowering, whereas this worldview, it empowers you with a bit of stoicism to face what it is you must face and attempt to build hope on one's own terms with one's family, friends, and whatever else provides some strength and solace. You think that's a fair characterization?
I think that's exactly right. And I think it's too infrequently noted, the connections between Stoicism and existentialism, right? Stoicism is this philosophy that counsels self-control and detachment and acceptance of one's fate. And one of the negative sides of Stoicism is that it is rather passive. Now, if one reads the Stoics fairly, they're not actually all that passive. But I like to think of existentialism as Stoicism without quietism. In other words, it counsels a kind of an acceptance and detachment and control within one's own mind. But it's not big on simply shrinking back, but rather taking charge and shaping the world as best one can to suit one's needs and pursue one's hopes and goals and dreams.
Yeah, as Camus put it, living in constant revolt against absurdity.
Yes.
Yeah, that's very active. That's very aggressive. That's not passive.
Right.
What do you think it is, before we move on, and maybe you want to discuss authenticity here, I'll find a way to put it in the same question. Give us your definition of authenticity, but what are the obstacles you see in the way of people attempting to discover their authentic self? Is the belief in objective meaning one of those obstacles, and is perhaps a fear of the responsibility of freedom that dictates to people to discover their own authentic self part of why more people don't do it?
Yeah, no, that's an important question. Ironically, or maybe it's just appropriate, the existentialists spend far more time speaking about inauthenticity in its various forms than they do authenticity and giving a positive account of it. As far as I'm concerned, though, I suppose in its simplest terms, that authenticity is about looking clearly at the world, right? Taking off your blinders, and then accepting the freedom and responsibility that comes with that, in sort of paraphrasing Spider-Man, right? With great freedom comes great responsibility. That's an authentic person. And I think the greatest obstacles that we face in being authentic are actually one another, in the sense that we make demands on one another to be a certain way. Anyone, whether they were the cheerleader or the nerd, thinking back on a high school experience, can realize that they were subject to peer pressure to conform and be a certain way. Even the oddballs tend to feel some conformity and some need to act in a certain way. And of course, this doesn't end with high school. It takes other forms in college, in the workplace, at home, among family members. And of course, one of the great things about true good friends and loved ones is that one feels at ease and feels comfortable to expose one's true and authentic self. And of course, it's become, I mentioned earlier, bandied about a term in political discourse where we're talking about presidential candidates, about whether they're authentic or not, and how they can appear authentic. And of course, it's refreshing to see somebody who's not acting the way a politician is expected to. But then we fall into the trap potentially of trying too hard to be authentic. I love the hip hop phrase of keeping it real.
Right.
That in a way is talking about being authentic. But Dave Chappelle had a great skit on keeping it real back when he had his show going, when keeping it real goes wrong, right? And people who try too hard to keep it real are really not keeping it real.
Yeah.
Very difficult to be the genuine thing, to be authentic by trying to be genuine or authentic.
Yeah, the people that I know in my own circle of friends who I view as authentic, it's hard to define what it is. That's somewhat why it's difficult to have this conversation in precise terms. It's almost like what the Supreme Court famously said about obscenity. It's hard to define, but you know it when you see it.
Yeah.
An authentic individual just has that indefinable quality.
Yeah.
But before I want to dive into your book a little more deeply, but one more question before we do. A disagreement came up with us over an email, and I want to air our dirty laundry here.
Oh, good.
When I referred to your excellent essay in the New York Times, I wrote about how I often find the search for meaning, when I see it in other people, to be self-destructive and dangerous. So we agree that objective meaning is an impossibility without God.
Yeah.
However, the search for subjective meaning often seems to land people in trouble, and oftentimes people who believe that they've found meaning are those who pose the greatest threat. The ISIS fighters, for example, are people who are very confident that they have found meaning. Now, nothing has to be that dramatic, but I often see people in my own life who feel they found some source of meaning, yet it's distracting them from some real source of happiness that they could find. Uh, and I prefer to talk about these things not with the word meaning, but with the words like pleasure, but a deep and sophisticated kind of pleasure that provides nourishment and enrichment. I often think that's what we mean when we say meaning. But there's no linear point A to point B meaning or narrative to it. It's just something that provides us with that nourishment. But you believe that subjective meaning is possible. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Well, I don't think we disagree all that much now that email turns out not to be the clearest form of communication. So now that I hear you, what you say sounds perfectly reasonable. One way of phrasing it that I've heard before and is that in terms of objective meaning, there would be no meaning of life. And one way of talking about subjective meaning would be to change the preposition and say meaning in life. And so it's up to the individual, sort of thrown on the beach of life like a piece of driftwood to make something out of himself. This is where that kind of self-creation comes in, to make one's own life a work of art, to make it something that, as you say, is nourishing, pleasurable, fulfilling. And of course, you're right that plenty of people on that pursuit end up in dangerous territory because they conclude that their discovered meaning in life or of life requires of them that they take actions that cause harm to others, and sometimes, of course, harm to themselves,
Right.
as you note as well.
Yeah. Well, very good. I want to move on now to the subtitle of your book, Capitalism Without Consumerism. I'm a free market advocate, as are you. I'm not a free market advocate to your degree, and that's something we'll get into in just a few minutes. But I want you to talk about that subtitle, if you're willing, because one of the most prevalent and popular attacks on free market capitalism is that it degrades people's lives. It turns them into passive consumers. Benjamin Barber wrote an entire book on this subject called Consumed, but he's far from alone in that criticism of capitalism. In your book, you give a interesting and, according to my assessment, devastating response to that criticism of capitalism, that it relegates people to the consumerist role and creates empty lives. How do you respond to that?
Well, thanks for asking and for speaking kindly of it in that sense. Well, my suggestion is that it certainly is not a logical necessity that someone is going to be turned into a drone, a mindless consumer as a result of living in a capitalist free market society. I grant that it is a real danger, an ever-present danger, and it really is at odds with the goal of existentialism, which is to achieve authenticity. If I'm such that I'm going to derive my own self-worth, fulfillment, pleasure, meaning by the car that I drive, the clothes that I wear, the zip code that I live in, I will really have fallen into the trap that many have well noted is quite possible. But if existentialism has things right, and that ultimately I have my own freedom and responsibility, then I can overcome it. Now I need to become self-aware. I need to be aware of my own faults and tendencies. If I'm walking by the Cinnabon stand at the mall or in the airport and I smell the waft of the delicious cinnamon and I don't want to ingest that for health reasons or diet reasons or whatever, I'm not simply a mindless drone. Sure, it has a huge pull on me. Sure, advertising is highly effective. Sure, the pressure to conform that I feel among peers or just in images that I see in the media is powerful. All of that granted, nonetheless, I can become self-aware and exercise my own freedom and responsibility.
Yeah, that's one of the strengths of the free market as I see it. And the free market, of course, has tremendous flaws, but it's like that old expression that's been attributed to many people, so no one's quite sure who actually said it. But free market capitalism is the worst system except for all of the others. One of its attributes is that transactions and associations are voluntary. So, yeah, you're right, and Benjamin Barber is even right to identify all of these pressures that exist in a free market system. And oftentimes with those pressures come incentives. But at the end of the transaction or at the end of the association, the individual is still choosing to do whatever the individual is choosing to do. And that gets us back to individualism, and that gets us to the really insightful premise with which you begin in your book, that existentialism is a philosophy that does not lend itself to socialism, as the common perception dictates, but a philosophy that lends itself to individualism and capitalism. And you have a great phrase in the book that existentialism goes with socialism just like it goes with cigarettes. There's no substantive connection there. There's an aesthetic one. So can you explain first, why is it that most people associate existentialism with socialism? And why is it that they're wrong to do so?
Yeah. Jean-Paul Sartre and his French cohort, with whom I would include Camus, who we've discussed, and his partner Simone de Beauvoir and many other acolytes, were in fact socialists. Now, prior to World War II, Sartre, and for most of the rest of the crowd, was sort of apolitical, was very focused on, the existentialism that we identify them with, and looking at what it means to be an existing individual rather than part of a group or part of a society. But as we know, the bad guys in World War II were on the political right, at least as some people slice the dividing line. We're thinking of the Nazis and the fascists. And on the political left, you have the Soviet Union and the communists and socialists, and they had not yet really had their flaws exposed quite to the extent that they were. And in French intellectual circles, all the cool kids were socialists. Sartre was not at first, but this is, ironically, I think, a bit of inauthenticity on this high priest of authenticity, Sartre himself, kind of caving and identifying as a socialist and twisting himself into pretzel knots, trying to somehow make that fit with his existentialism. So that's sort of the historical background of it. I think if anyone were to read the kind of chief texts of existentialism from Sartre and read the chief texts of both socialism and free market capitalism, no one would think to combine existentialism and socialism the way historically it happened. And yeah, thanks for picking up on that association. I think it's a kind of a cultural, sociological connection, just the way all of the existentialists were heavy smokers and we associate, smoking cigarettes with existentialism. So too, we associate socialism with existentialism. Doesn't need to be. I don't smoke and I'm not a socialist.
Well, yeah, I used to smoke, and I used to be a socialist. But about the time I reached the age of reason, I quit both. So now that I'm healthy and free, let me ask you then, well, why does existentialism, in your view, and you, of course, spend a great deal of the book drawing this argument out, but if you could summarize it, why does existentialism lend itself to the free market capitalistic system of economy and governance?
Yeah, good. So I don't think that they necessarily have to go together. I mean, it's of the essence. There's no essence, but it's of the nature of being an existentialist that one chooses freely. And so I don't think it's impossible to be an existentialist socialist. However, I think hand in glove, being an existentialist goes more readily with being a free market capitalist, in the sense that existentialism, as I understand it, my version of it at least, emphasizes individual freedom and individual responsibility. Socialism does not emphasize those values. For the most part, it externalizes responsibility. We're all in this together, is the socialist mantra. Whereas the free market capitalist mantra sounds very much like an existentialist mantra, namely, you're on your own. As in that great title we talked about before, Alone Together. So existentialism and free market capitalism, as I see it, both emphasize internalizing responsibility. And so that really is the starting point. They're both philosophies, if you will, of individualism and of individual responsibility chiefly.
I once interviewed Shelby Steele, and anyone watching who's interested in that can find it easily online. The Federalist published it. And Steele discussed that freedom is the most exhilarating thing in the world for obvious reasons. It provides opportunities for pleasure and for fulfillment and success and achievement. But it also is the most terrifying thing in the world, because with it comes so much responsibility. And with responsibility comes accountability. And sometimes people want to cower from being held to account, so they conform to social pressures and expectations, or they embrace an ideology, political or theological, that somehow allows them to find an escape hatch from freedom.
I think that hits the nail right on the head. And Sartre famously said that we're condemned to be free, which highlights the negative side of freedom, that it's an awful, terrifying, potentially gut-wrenching realization and thing to accept. And I think of the Grand Inquisitor section of the Brothers Karamazov, where the suggestion is that what humans want most is to hand over their freedom and be told what to do. And I think the existentialists themselves, and I myself, being human, are not free from that. So of course, the believer will see genuineness in Kierkegaard's embrace of Christianity. To me, it looks like someone accepting what Marx would call the opium of the masses.